9. Not your typical student-teacher conference. Wednesday morning. Arya's father, Baran, rubbed his bushy black hair and hand-signaled out the Subaru window that he was making a left-hand turn. The turn signals had stopped working last night, so he was driving Arya and Mike to their second day of school and taking the car to the shop. "You guys happy to be back in America?" Baran asked. Mike, who sat next to Arya in the backseat, grinned. "America rocks." He went back to maniacally punching the tiny buttons of his PSP. It made a farting noise and Mike pumped one fist in the air. Arya's father smiled and navigated across the single-lane stone bridge, waving to a neighbor. As he passed. "Well, good. Now, why does it rock?" "America rocks because it has lacrosse," Mike said, not taking his eyes off his PSP. "And hotter chicks. And a Hooters in King of Prussia." Arya laughed, like Mike had been inside Hooters. And less. Oh God, had he? She shivered in her Kelly green alpaca shrug and stared out the window at the thick fog. A woman wearing a long, red-hooded stadium jacket that said, "Upper Main Line Soccer Mom," tried to stop her German Shepherd from chasing a squirrel across the street. At the corner, two blondes with high-tech baby carriages stood together gossiping. There was one word to describe yesterday's English class: brutal. After Ezra blurted out, "Holy shit," the whole class turned and stared at her. Hannah Marin, who sat in front of her, whispered in a not-so-quiet voice, "Did you sleep with the teacher?" Arya considered, for a half-second, that maybe Hannah had written her the text message about Ezra. Hannah was one of the few people who knew about Pigtunia, but why would Hannah care? Ezra, Mr. Fitz, had dispelled the laughing quickly, and come up with the lamest. "Excuse for swearing in class," he said, and Arya quoted in her head, "I was afraid that a bee had flown into my pants, and I thought the bee was going to sting me, and so I yelled out in terror," as Ezra then started talking about 5-paragraph themes and the class's syllabus. Arya couldn't concentrate. She was the bee that had flown into his pants. She couldn't stop looking at his wolfish eyes and his sumptuous pink mouth. When he peeked in her direction out of the corner of his eye, her heart did 2.5 somersaults off the high dive and landed in her stomach. Ezra was the guy for her, and she was the girl for him. She just knew it. So what if he was her teacher? There had to be a way to make it work. Her father pulled up to Rosewood's stone-gated entrance. In the distance, Arya noticed a vintage powder blue Volkswagen Beetle parked in the teacher's lot. She knew that car from Snookers. It was Ezra's. She checked her watch. 15 minutes until homeroom. Mike shot out of the car. Arya opened her door as well, but her father touched her forearm. "Hang on a sec," he said. "But I have to." She glanced longingly at Ezra's bug. "Just for a minute." Her father turned down the radio volume. Arya slumped back in her seat. "You've seemed a little." He flicked his wrist back and forth uncertainly. "You okay?" Arya shrugged. "About what?" Her father sighed. "Well, I don't know. Being back. And we haven't talked about, in a while." Arya fidgeted with her jacket's zipper. "What's there to talk about?" Baran stuck a cigarette he'd rolled before they left into his mouth. "I can't imagine how hard it's been keeping quiet. But I love you. You know that, right?" Arya looked out at the parking lot again. "Yeah, I know," she said. "I have to go. I'll see you at 3. Before he could answer, Arya shot out of the car, blood rushing in her ears. How was she supposed to be Icelandic Arya, who left her past behind, if one of her worst memories of Rosewood kept bubbling to the surface? It had happened in May of 7th grade. Rosewood Day had dismissed the students early for teacher conferences, so Arya and Ollie headed to Sparrow, Hollis campus's music store to search for new CDs. As they cut through a back alley, Arya noticed her father's familiar beat-up brown Honda Civic in a far-off space in an empty parking lot. As Arya and Ollie walked toward the car to leave a note, they realized there was someone inside. Actually, two someones. Arya's father, Baran, and a girl, about 20 years old, kissing his neck. That's when Baran looked up and saw Arya. She sprinted away before she had to see any more and before he could stop her. Ollie followed Arya all the way back to her house but didn't try to stop her when Arya said she wanted to be alone. Later that night, Baran came up to Arya's room to explain. It wasn't what it looked like, he said. But Arya wasn't stupid. Every year her father invited his students over to their house for get-to-know-you cocktails. And Arya had seen that girl walk through her very door. Her name was Meredith. Arya remembered, because Meredith had gotten tipsy and spelled out her name on the refrigerator in plastic letter magnets. When Meredith left, instead of shaking her dad's hand as the other kids had, she gave him a lingering kiss on his cheek. Baran begged Arya not to tell her mom. He promised her it would never happen again. She decided to believe him, and so she kept his secret. He'd never said so, but Arya believed Meredith was the reason her dad took his sabbatical when he did. You promised yourself you wouldn't think about it, Arya thought, glancing back over her shoulder. Her father hand signaled out of the Rosewood parking lot. Arya walked into the narrow hallway of the faculty wing. Ezra's office was at the end of the hall, next to a small, cozy window seat. She stopped in the doorway and watched him as he typed something into his computer. Finally, she knocked. Ezra's blue eyes widened when he saw her. He looked adorable in his button-down white shirt, blue rosewood blazer, green cords, and beat-up black loafers. The corners of his mouth curled up into the tiniest, shyest smile. Hey, he said. Arya hovered in the doorway. Can I talk to you? Arya asked. Her voice squeaked a little. Ezra hesitated, pushing a lock of hair out of his eyes. Arya noticed a Snoopy band-aid wrapped around his left pinky finger. Sure, he said softly. Come in. She walked into his office and shut the door. It was empty, except for a wide, heavy wood desk, two folding chairs, and a computer. She sat down on the empty folding chair. So, Arya said. Hey again. Ezra answered, grinning. He lowered his eyes and took a gulp from his Rosewood Daycrest coffee mug. Listen, he started. About yesterday, Arya said at the same time. They both laughed. Ladies first. Ezra smiled. Arya scratched the back of her neck where her straight black hair was drawn up in a ponytail. I wanted to talk about us. Ezra nodded, but didn't say anything. Arya wiggled in her chair. Well, I guess it's shocking that I'm your student, after, snookers. But if you don't mind, I don't. Ezra cupped his hand around his mug. Arya listened to the school-issued wall clock ticking off the seconds. I don't think it's a good idea, he said softly. You said you were older. Arya laughed, not sure how serious he was. I never told you how old I was. She lowered her eyes. You just assumed. Yeah, but you shouldn't have implied it. Ezra responded. Everybody lies about their age. Arya said quietly. Ezra ran his hand through his hair. But, he met her eyes and sighed. Look, I think you're amazing, Arya. I do. I met you in that bar, and I was like, wow, who is this? She's so unlike any other girl I've ever met. Arya looked down, feeling both pleased and a little queasy. Ezra reached across the desk and touched his hand to hers. It was warm, dry, and soothing, but then quickly pulled away. But this isn't meant to be, Cause, well, you're my student. I could get in a lot of trouble. You don't want me to get in trouble, do you? No one would know, Arya said faintly, although she couldn't help but think about that bizarre text from yesterday, and that maybe someone already knew. It took Ezra a long time to respond. It seemed to Arya that he was trying to make up his mind. She looked at him hopefully. I'm sorry, Arya, he finally mumbled. But I think you should go. Arya stood up, feeling her cheeks burn. Of course. Arya wrapped her hands around the top of the chair. It felt like hot coals were bouncing around her insides. I'll see you in class, Ezra whispered. She shut the door carefully. In the hall, teachers swarmed around her, rushing off to their homerooms. She decided to get to her locker by cutting through the commons. She needed some fresh air. Outside, Arya heard a familiar girl's laugh. She froze for a second. When would she stop thinking she heard Allison everywhere? She trudged not on the common's winding stone path, like you were supposed to, but through the grass. The morning fog was so dense that Arya could barely see her legs below her. Her footprints vanished in the squishy grass as quickly as she made them. Good. This seemed like an appropriate time to disappear completely. "10 single girls have way more fun." That afternoon, Emily was standing in the student parking lot, lost in thought, when someone threw their hands over her eyes. Emily jumped, startled. Whoa, chill, it's just me. Emily turned and sighed with relief. It was only Maya. Emily had been so distracted and paranoid since getting that bizarre note yesterday. She'd been about to unlock her car. Her mom let her and Carolyn take it to school on the condition they drive carefully and call when they got there, and grab her swimming bag for practice. Sorry, Emily said. I thought never mind. I missed you today. Maya smiled. Me too. Emily smiled back. She'd tried calling Maya this morning to offer her a ride to school, but Maya's mom said she'd already left. So, how are you? Well, I could be better today. Maya had secured her wild dark hair off her face with adorable iridescent pink butterfly clips. Oh yeah, Emily tilted her head. Maya pursed her lips together and slid one of her feet out of her Oakley sandals. Her second toe was longer than her big toe, just like Emily's. I'd be better if you came somewhere with me, right now, but I have swimming, Emily said, hearing Eeyore in her voice again. Maya took her hand and swung it. What if I told you that where we're going sort of involves swimming? Emily narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? You have to trust me. Even though she'd been close to Hannah and Spencer and Arya, all of Emily's favorite memories were of hanging out alone with Ollie, like when they dressed up in bulky snow pants too. Sled down Bayberry Hill, talked about their ideal boyfriends, or cried about the Jenna thing from 6th grade and comforted each other. When it was just the two of them, Emily saw a slightly less perfect Ollie, which somehow made her seem even more perfect, and Emily felt she could be herself. It seemed like days, weeks, years had gone by where Emily hadn't been herself, and she thought that now, she could have something like that with Maya. She missed having a best friend. Right now, Ben and all the other boys were probably changing into their suits, slapping one another's bare butts with wet towels. Coach Lauren was writing the practice sets on the big marker board and carrying out the appropriate fins, boys, and paddles. And the girls on the team were complaining because they all had their periods at the same time. Did she dare miss the second day of practice? Emily squeezed her plastic fish keychain. I suppose I could tell Carolyn I had to tutor somebody in Spanish, she murmured. Emily knew Carolyn wouldn't buy that, but she probably wouldn't squeal on Emily, either. Triple checking the parking lot to see if anyone was watching, Emily smiled and unlocked the car. All right, let's go. My brother and I checked out this spot this weekend, Maya said as Emily pulled into the gravel parking lot. Emily stepped out of the car and stretched. I forgot about this place. They were at the Marwin Trail, which was about 5 miles long and bordered a deep creek. She and her friends used to ride their bikes here all the time. Ollie and Spencer would pedal furiously at the end and usually tie, and stop at the little snack bar by the swimming area for Butterfingers and Diet Cokes. As she followed Maya up a muddy slope, Maya grabbed her arm. Oh, I forgot to tell you. My mom said your mom stopped over yesterday while we were in school. She brought over brownies. Really?" Emily responded, confused. She wondered why her mother hadn't mentioned anything to her at dinner. "The brownies were delish. My brother and I polished them off last night. They came to the dirt trail. A canopy of oaks sheltered them. The air had that fresh, woodsy smell and it felt about 20 degrees cooler." "We're not there yet." Maya took her hand and led her down the path to a small stone bridge. 20 feet beneath it, the stream widened. The calm water glittered in the late afternoon sun. Maya walked right up to the edge of the bridge and stripped down to her matching pale pink bra and undies. She threw her clothes in a pile, stuck her tongue out at Emily, and jumped off. "Wait." Emily rushed to the edge. Did Maya know how deep this was? A full 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi later, Emily heard a splash. Maya's head popped back up out of the water. "Told you it involved swimming. Come on, strip." Emily glanced at Maya's pile of clothes. She really hated undressing in front of people, even the swim team girls, who saw her every day. She slowly took off her pleated rosewood skirt, crossing her legs over each other so Maya couldn't see her bare, muscular thighs, and then pulled at the tank top she wore under her uniform blouse. She decided to keep it on. She looked over the edge to the creek and, steeling herself, she jumped. A moment later, the water hugged her body. It was pleasantly warm and thick with mud, not cold and clean like the pool. The built-in shelf bra of her tank top puffed out with water. "It's like a sauna in here," Maya said. Yet Emily paddled over to the shallower area, where Maya was standing. Emily realized she could see Maya's nipples straight through her bra, and cut her eyes away. "I used to go cliff diving with Justin all the time back in Cali," Maya said. "He'd stand up at the top and, think about it for 10 minutes before jumping. I like how you didn't even hesitate." Emily floated on her back and smiled. She couldn't help it. She gobbled up Maya's compliments like cheesecake. Maya squirted Emily with water through her cupped hands. Some of it squirted right into her mouth. The creek water tasted gooey and almost metallic, nothing like chlorinated pool water. "I think me and Justin are going to break up," Maya said. Emily swam closer to the edge and stood up. "Really? Why?" "Yeah. The long-distance thing is too stressful. He calls me, all the time. I've only been gone for a few days, and he's already sent me 2 letters." "Ha," Emily answered, sifting her fingers through the murky water. Then something occurred to her. She turned to Maya. "Did you, put a note in my swim locker yesterday?" Maya frowned. "What, after school?" "No, you walked me home. Remember right?" She didn't really think Maya had written the note, but things would have been so much simpler if she had. "What did the note say?" Emily shook her head. "Never mind. It was nothing." She cleared her throat. "You know, I think I might break up with my boyfriend too." Whoa. Emily wouldn't have been any more surprised if a bluebird had just flown out of her mouth. "Really?" Maya said. Emily blinked water out of her eyes. "I don't know. Maybe." Maya stretched her arms over her head, and Emily caught sight of that scar on her wrist again. She looked away. "Well, fuck a moose," Maya said. Emily smiled. "Huh, it's this thing I say sometimes," Maya said. "It means, screw it." She turned away and shrugged. "I guess it's silly." "No, I like it," Emily said. "Fuck a moose." She giggled. She always felt funny swearing, as if her mom could hear her from their kitchen, 10 miles away. "You totally should break up with your boyfriend, though," Maya said. "No, why?" "Why? That would mean we'd both be single." "And that means what?" Emily asked. The forest was very quiet and still. Maya moved closer to her. And that means, we can have fun. She grabbed Emily by the shoulder and dunked her under the water. Hey, Emily squealed. She splashed Maya back, ripping her whole arm through the water, creating a giant wave. Then she grabbed Maya by the leg and started tickling underneath her toes. Help! Maya screamed. Not my feet. I'm so ticklish. I've found your weakness, Emily crowed, maniacally dragging Maya over to the waterfall. Maya managed to wrench her foot away and pounced on Emily's shoulders from behind. Maya's hands drifted up Emily's sides, then down to her stomach, where she tickled her. Emily squealed. She finally pushed Maya into a small cave in the rocks. I hope there are no bats in here, Maya squealed. Beams of sunlight pierced through the cave's tiny openings, making a halo around the top of Maya's sopping wet head. You have to come in here, Maya said. She held out her hand. Emily stood next to her, feeling the cave's smooth, cool sides. The sounds of her breathing echoed off the narrow walls. They looked at each other and grinned. Emily bit her lip. This was such a perfect friend moment. It made her feel kind of melancholy and nostalgic. Maya's eyes turned down in concern. What's wrong? Emily took a deep breath. Well, you know that girl who lived in your house? Allison, yeah. She went missing. Right after 7th grade. She was never found. Maya shivered slightly. I heard something about that. Emily hugged herself. She was getting cold, too. We were really close. Maya moved closer to Emily and put her arm around her. I didn't realize yet. Emily's chin wobbled. I just wanted you to know. Thanks. A few long moments passed. Emily and Maya continued to hug. Then, Maya backed off. I kind of lied earlier about why I want to break up with Justin. Emily raised an eyebrow. Curious. I'm not sure if I like guys, Maya said quietly. It's weird. I think they're cute, but when I get alone with them, I don't want to be with them. I'd rather be with, like, someone more like me. She smiled crookedly. You know. Emily ran her hands over her face and hair. Maya's gaze felt too close all of a sudden. She started. No, she didn't know. The bushes above them moved. Emily flinched. Her mom used to hate when she came to this trail. You never knew what kind of kidnappers or murderers hid in places like this. The woods were still for a moment, but then a flock of birds scattered wildly into the sky. Emily flattened herself up against the rock. Was someone watching them? Who was that laughing? The laugh sounded familiar. Then Emily heard heavy breathing. Goosebumps rose up on her arms and she peered out of the cave. It was only a group of boys. Suddenly, they burst into the creek, wielding sticks like swords. Emily backed away from Maya and out of the waterfall. Where are you going? Maya called. Emily looked at Maya, and then at the boys, who had abandoned the sticks and were now throwing rocks at each other. One of them was Mike Montgomery, her old friend Arya's little brother. He'd grown up quite a bit since she last saw him. And wait, Mike went to Rosewood. Would he recognize her? Emily climbed out of the water and started scurrying up the hill. She turned back to Maya. I have to get back to school before Carolyn's done with swim. Meeing. She pulled on her skirt. Do you want me to throw down your clothes, whatever? At that, she stepped out of the waterfall and waded through the water, her sheer underwear clinging to her butt. Maya climbed up the slope slowly, not once covering up her stomach or boobs with her hands. The freshman boys stopped what they were doing and stared. And even though Emily didn't want to, she couldn't help but stare too.